In the heart of Nebraska's rolling prairie, where autumn winds whisper secrets across endless fields of wheat, a simple act of kindness is about to change two lives forever. Mike Reeves, a divorced carpenter with calloused hands and a gentle soul, pulls up to Sarah Mitchell's weathered barn in his old pickup truck, seeing nothing but another job to help cover his daughter's college tuition. The storm-damaged structure before him is just wood and nails. A problem to solve. A way to make ends meet. What Mike doesn't know is that the quiet widow who hired him owns not just this barn, but the 5,000 acres surrounding it. Sarah Mitchell, whose name graces half the property deeds in 3 counties, stands in the shadow of her empire, watching this man who treats her like any other neighbor in need. For 15 years, she's carried the weight of running one of the largest cattle operations in the state, all while keeping her heart locked away as tightly as the dusty files in her office safe. This isn't just another renovation story. This is about how a broken barn brings together 2 people who stopped believing in second chances. As autumn fades into winter, what begins as a simple repair job evolves into something neither of them saw coming. Between the swing of his hammer and the soft glow of her evening porch light, they'll discover that sometimes the most precious things we build aren't made of wood and nails at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn morning was crisp when Mike Reeves stepped out of his truck, his worn leather toolbox catching the early light. That crayon heart his daughter had drawn years ago was still visible on the handle, faded but stubborn, like so many of his hopes. He squinted up at the barn's weather-beaten frame, his experienced eye already cataloguing the work ahead. The storm had done its damage, but there was good bones here. Someone had built this place to last. A faded sign caught his attention. Mitchell and Sons Ranch, hanging crooked from a single nail. He made a mental note to fix that too, though. It wasn't in the original scope of work. Small gestures mattered. His father had taught him that, and Mike had built his reputation on attention to detail. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the house like a shadow becoming solid, her steps measured and deliberate across the gravel drive. She wore practical clothes, jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt, but there was something in her bearing that spoke of quiet dignity. Her grey-streaked hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face lined with years of sun and worry, but her eyes were sharp and clear as she extended her hand. "Mr. Reeves, thank you for coming out so early." "Mike, please," he said, his handshake firm but careful. "Better to get started before the day heats up." He gestured toward the barn. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Sarah nodded, following him, at a careful distance. Mike walked the perimeter first, his movements methodical. The storm had torn off sections of the roof, and water damage had followed. But what caught his eye was the craftsmanship of the original structure. Dovetail joints, hand-hewn beams. Someone had poured their heart into this building. "Your husband's work?" he asked, touching a particularly fine piece of joinery. Something flickered across Sarah's face. Pain, pride, maybe both. "Yes," she said softly. "James loved this barn, said it was the heart of any working ranch." Mike nodded, understanding in his bones. He'd seen it countless times. Buildings that were more than buildings, that held memories in their beams and stories in their foundations. He knew what he was doing. This is quality work. Sarah's posture relaxed slightly, and Mike realized he'd said exactly the right thing. Not empty sympathy, but professional respect for the work itself. He continued his inspection, making notes. In a small pad he kept in his shirt pocket, aware of Sarah watching him with those careful eyes. Finally, he turned back to her. "I can save it," he said simply. "Need to shore up the roof first, stop any more water damage. Then we can look at replacing the compromised sections. Might take a few weeks if you want it done right." "I do," Sarah said, and something in her voice made Mike look up from his notes. She was staring at the barn with an intensity that spoke of more than property value. "Whatever it takes." Mike quoted her a fair price, not cheap, but honest for the work involved. He'd learned long ago that cutting corners only led to cutting ties with clients. Sarah didn't haggle, just nodded and asked when he could start. "Tomorrow," he said, already mentally rearranging his schedule. "I'll bring my full kit, get the roof secured before any more weather moves in." As he drove away, glancing in his rearview mirror, he saw Sarah still standing there, watching him go. The crooked sign caught the morning light, and for a moment he could almost see what this place had been in its prime. By the time he was finished, he promised himself it would be that way again. What he couldn't know, as his truck kicked up dust on the long driveway, was that Sarah Mitchell was watching him with more than professional interest. In her world of boardroom meetings and million-dollar decisions, his simple honesty and capable hands were like a drink of cool water in a desert she hadn't known she was crossing. Morning fog still clung to the prairie when Mike arrived the next day, his truck bed loaded with supplies. The sun was just beginning to burn through, casting long shadows across the barnyard. As he gathered his tools, movement caught his eye. Sarah, in her kitchen window, a coffee mug in hand. Behind her, barely visible in the growing light, stood a large framed photograph, a man in military dress uniform, his stance proud, but his smile gentle. James Mitchell, Mike guessed, the husband who'd built this barn with such care. The screen door creaked, and Sarah emerged with 2 steaming mugs. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering him one. "It's cold enough to see your breath. Thank you," Mike said, accepting the coffee. It was good, strong and hot, no fancy frills. Working man's coffee, he appreciated that. The morning unfolded in a comfortable rhythm. Mike worked methodically on the roof, replacing damaged sections while Sarah moved through her own routine below. He couldn't help but notice how she handled the constant stream of phone calls with quiet authority, speaking about cattle prices and feed contracts with the ease of someone who'd lived this life for decades. Around mid-morning, a truck pulled up, ranch hands reporting for work. Mike watched with interest as Sarah transformed, her quiet demeanor shifting into something more commanding as she gave clear, knowledgeable directions about the day's tasks. The men treated her with obvious respect, but there was something else in their manner, a deference that seemed to go beyond the usual employee-employer relationship. The sound of his phone buzzing interrupted his observations. "Hey, sweetheart," he answered, recognizing his daughter's ringtone. "Everything okay?" "Dad, I just got my first A in advanced biology." Katie's voice bubbled with excitement. "Professor Hansen said my research paper was graduate-level work." Mike sat back on his heels, grinning broadly. "That's my girl. I knew all those late-night study sessions would pay off." "Thanks for believing in me, Dad. I know the tuition is tough." "Hey, none of that," he interrupted gently. "You just keep focusing on your studies. I've got plenty of work." His eyes drifted to the barn's damaged roof. "Speaking of which, I should get back to it. Love you, kiddo." "Love you too, Dad." When he looked up from the call, he found Sarah watching him, something soft in her expression. She quickly turned away, busying herself with some papers, but not before Mike caught a glimpse of what might have been understanding, or maybe loneliness. The day progressed, punctuated by the steady rhythm of hammer on nail and the distant lowing of cattle. Sarah brought him lunch, a simple sandwich and an apple, and they ate in companionable silence on the weathered porch steps. She asked about his daughter, her voice careful, as if testing the waters of personal conversation. "Katie's 19, Mike said, pride warming his voice. "Pre-med at the state university, smart as they come, gets that from her mother. And the determination to succeed? Where does that come from?" Mike glanced at her, catching the slight smile, playing at the corners of her mouth. "Maybe a little of that comes from me," he admitted. A comfortable quiet settled between them, broken only by the sound of prairie wind in the tall grass. Mike found himself studying Sarah's profile, noticing how the sunlight caught the silver in her hair, how her hands, though elegant, showed the marks of real work. "Your husband," he he said finally, nodding toward the kitchen window where the photograph stood. He served. Sarah's face softened with old grief and pride. Marines. 20 years. He built this barn after retiring, said he needed a project to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet. She traced a pattern in the dust beside her. He understood about determination, too. The moment hung between them, delicate as spider silk. Then Sarah stood, brushing off her jeans. "I should let you get back to work," she said, but her voice held a warmth that hadn't been there that morning. As Mike climbed back up to the roof, he found himself thinking about the photograph in the window, about the man who'd built this barn, and about the woman who carried on alone. He understood something about that too, about picking up the pieces and building something new from them, one careful day at a time. The rest of the week fell into an easy rhythm, as natural as breathing. Mike would arrive just as the sun crept over the horizon, and Sarah would be waiting with coffee. Sometimes they'd talk, their voices quiet in the morning stillness, but more often they'd just stand together, watching the prairie come alive with dawn light. During his lunch break, Mike sat in his truck, reading over the letter he'd received that morning. The University of Nebraska letterhead seemed to gleam in the autumn sunlight. "Dear Ms. Catherine Reeves, we are pleased to confirm your academic scholarship for the upcoming semester." His hands trembled slightly as he folded the paper, tucking it carefully into his wallet. The scholarship wouldn't cover everything, but it would help. Another small victory in the ongoing battle to give his daughter the future she deserved. From his perch on the roof, Mike watched Sarah move through her days with quiet efficiency. She had a way about her that reminded him of a conductor leading an orchestra, every movement purposeful, every decision precise. When ranch hands came to her with questions about cattle rotation or equipment repairs, she never hesitated, her answers showing years of accumulated knowledge. "You know a lot about ranching," he commented one afternoon as she handed him up a bundle of shingles. Sarah's smile held a hint of something, pride maybe, or amusement. "You pick things up over the years," she said simply, but there was a weight to her words that suggested more. Their conversations began to stretch longer, especially during the golden hour before sunset, when the light turned the prairie to flame. Sarah would bring out glasses of iced tea, and they'd sit on the porch steps, watching the shadows lengthen across the land. "How'd you learn your trade?" she asked one evening, watching him clean his tools with methodical care. Mike's hands moved automatically, oilcloth gliding over steel. "My father was a carpenter. He believed in learning things right the first time." He smiled at a memory. "Used to say shortcuts are just longer paths in disguise." Wise man. He was. Mike paused, considering. "After the divorce, his workshop became my sanctuary. Something about working with wood, it makes sense, you know. Put in the effort, do it right, and things come together the way they should." Sarah nodded, her eyes distant. "James used to say something similar about the ranch. The land doesn't lie, he'd tell me. It gives back exactly what you put into it." They shared a look of understanding. Two people who knew the value of work. And done well. The moment stretched, comfortable as an old quilt, until Sarah cleared her throat and stood. "I should check on the evening feed," she said, but lingered a moment longer. "Will you be here tomorrow?" "Bright and early," Mike assured her, pretending not to notice how her shoulders relaxed at his words. That night, driving home under a sky scattered with stars, Mike found himself thinking about Sarah's quiet strength, about the way she seemed most herself in these evening conversations. There was something about her that didn't quite add up. The simple ranch widow who spoke with such authority, who carried herself with such understated confidence, but questioning it felt wrong somehow, like breaking the spell of these autumn days. Whatever Sarah's story was, she had her reasons for keeping parts of it private. Mike understood about privacy, about the need to hold certain things close. Besides, he had his own concerns. Katie's tuition would be due soon, and even with the scholarship, the numbers kept him awake at night. The barn job would help, but there was always another bill, another semester, another mountain to climb. Still, as he pulled into his driveway, Mike couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow morning there would be coffee steam rising in the cool air, and Sarah's quiet presence and honest work to be done. Sometimes he was learning that was enough to build a day on, maybe even enough to build a future. The morning peace shattered with the sharp ring of Sarah's phone. Mike, already balanced on a roof beam, watched as she answered it, her whole demeanor shifting. Gone was the gentle woman who shared dawn coffee with him. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone who spoke in clipped tones about profit margins and market futures. "The board's recommendation is clear," she said, pacing the barnyard. "But I won't approve the expansion without reviewing the environmental impact reports." She paused, listening. "No, that timeline isn't acceptable. I need those numbers by Friday." Mike tried not to listen, focusing instead on the task at hand, but something about her voice commanded attention. When he glanced down again, Sarah was hurriedly gathering papers that had scattered across her desk by the barn entrance, documents covered in complex charts and official letterheads. Their eyes met briefly before she tucked everything into a folder, her movements quick but controlled. His own phone buzzed moments later. Linda's name flashed on the screen. His ex-wife. Mike sighed, already knowing what this call would bring. "The tuition payment is late," Linda said without preamble. "Katie's worried sick about being dropped from her classes." Mike closed his eyes, leaning against the barn's wooden frame. "I've got it handled. The money will be there by Friday." "That's what you said last month. She can't keep—" "I said I've got it handled." The words came out sharper than he intended. Below, Sarah pretended to be occupied with her own papers, but he could tell she was listening. "The scholarship came through, and I'm working on a good job right now. Katie won't lose her spot." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. Finally, Linda sighed. "She's too bright to have to worry about this, Mike. I know." The words tasted bitter. "I know she is." After he hung up, the morning seemed darker somehow, the autumn air sharper. He threw himself into his work, letting the rhythm of hammer and nail drown out his thoughts. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that he realized Sarah had disappeared into the house. When she returned, she carried 2 mugs of coffee and something else, a determination in her step that made him pause. "Take a break," she called up. "You've been at it for hours." He climbed down carefully, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod. They sat on their usual spot on the porch steps, the wood warm from the afternoon sun. Sarah seemed to be weighing her words, turning them over like coins. "My husband," she began slowly, "believed in helping people who worked hard. He said it was one of the responsibilities that came with—" She stopped abruptly, redirecting. "What I mean is, if you need an advance on the job for Katie's tuition." "No." Mike's response was immediate, gentle but firm. "I appreciate it, but no. This job, He gestured between them, searching for the right word. "Friendship. I'd like to keep it clean. Simple." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. "Pain? Relief?" She nodded, and they sat in silence as the sun tracked across the sky. A ranch hand approached with questions about cattle counts, and Sarah excused herself, leaving Mike alone with his thoughts. Later, as he packed up his tools, he found a small note tucked under his water bottle. Sarah's handwriting was elegant but practical. "You're a good father. She's lucky to have you." The simple words hit him like a physical force, and he had to take a moment before he could fold the paper and tuck it into his shirt pocket. Close to his heart. The drive home was long and quiet, his mind full of Sarah's offer and all the complications it would bring. He thought about the way she spoke on the phone, the authority in her voice, about the papers she so quickly hid, the deference of the ranch hands. There was more to her story, he was certain now, but did he want to know what it was? Sometimes clarity came at the cost of something precious, like morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, or notes written in elegant, practical script. The old rocking chair caught Mike's eye one morning as he was carrying lumber past Sarah's porch. It sat forgotten in a corner, its wood weathered and one runner cracked, but he could see the quality of the craftsmanship beneath years of neglect. The kind of chair meant for summer evenings and watching sunsets, for holding babies and telling stories. During his lunch break, instead of reading or making calls, he found himself examining the chair. The repair would be simple enough. He had the right tools in his truck and the wood he needed for the runner. He worked quickly, efficiently, letting muscle memory guide his hands while his mind wandered. Sarah found him there an hour later, running his palm over the newly smooth wood. She stopped short, one hand rising to her throat. "My mother's chair," she said softly. "I kept meaning to have it fixed, but—" She trailed off, eyes fixed on the restored runner, the gentle sway. As Mike set it rocking, "Hope you don't mind," he said, suddenly uncertain. "I noticed it needed some attention." "Mind?" Sarah shook her head, crossing the porch to run her fingers along the repaired arm. "It's beautiful. Mother used to sit here every evening watching the sun set over the fields. After she passed, James would find me here sometimes, when the ranch felt too big, too empty." Mike watched her face, seeing memories play across it like shadows. "And now I never seem to find the time to sit." She smiled, but it held a touch of sadness. "There's always another meeting, another decision, another—" She caught herself, that familiar guarded look returning to her eyes. "Try it," Mike suggested, pretending not to notice her slip. "See if it still holds the sunset like it used to." Sarah hesitated, then settled into the chair. She closed her eyes as it rocked, something tight in her shoulders easing. "It's exactly the same. How did you know how to—" "Your mother had good taste. This is black walnut. They don't make many chairs like this anymore. Hand-carved rockers, each one unique." He knelt beside the chair, showing her the grain of the wood. "See? These patterns. Each line tells a story. Like the wrinkles on a face," Sarah mused, tracing the patterns with her finger. Their hands brushed and neither pulled away immediately. The contact was brief but electric, leaving Mike's skin tingling. "My grandmother had a chair like this," he found himself saying. "She used to tell me that a good rocking chair needs 3 things: strong wood, careful crafting, and years of love worn into the grain." He smiled at the memory. "I never understood what she meant until I started working with wood myself." Sarah's eyes met his, holding something warm and wondering. "And now I think she was right. Some things get better with age and care, more valuable, not less." He was still kneeling beside the chair, close enough to see the flecks of gold in Sarah's eyes, to catch the faint scent of her shampoo, something clean and simple, like fresh air. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken things. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat. "Thank you, Mike, for fixing it, for understanding its worth." He stood, suddenly aware of how close they'd been. "Some things deserve to be restored," he said simply, "to be given another chance at their purpose." That evening, as Mike packed up his tools, he saw Sarah through the kitchen window. She was in the rocking chair, moved inside by the porch door, a book open in her lap. But she wasn't reading. Instead, she was running her hand along the arm of the chair, lost in thought. The last light of day caught her face, and for a moment she looked younger, unburdened, just a woman in a rocking chair, watching the sun. It'd paint the prairie gold. Mike drove home that night, with the memory of her smile playing in his mind, and the ghost of her touch still tingling on his skin. He'd meant what he said about second chances. He just hadn't expected to find himself hoping for one of his own. The storm came without warning, rolling across the prairie like a freight train. Mike was high on the barn's roof when he saw it approaching. A wall of dark clouds stacked against the horizon, shot through with lightning. Below, Sarah burst. From the house, her voice nearly lost in the rising wind. "Mike, get down from there." He was already moving, gathering his tools with practiced speed. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in minutes, and the air held that metallic taste that promised hail. As his boots hit the ground, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. "The barn's not sealed yet," he shouted over the wind. Water damage could undo everything we've done. Sarah was already moving, pulling tarps from a storage shed. Together, they worked against the storm, securing what they could. The wind tried to tear the tarps from their hands. But Mike had planned for this. He'd installed temporary anchors along the roofline days ago, just in case. Inside! Sarah grabbed his arm as thunder cracked overhead. We've done what we can. They made it. To the barn just as the storm hit full force. Rain hammered the roof like bullets, and wind howled through the gaps they hadn't yet sealed. In the gloom, Sarah's face was pale but determined. The south corner, she said, pointing. It's not properly covered. Mike saw it too. A tarp coming. Loose, threatening to expose the newly replaced beams to the deluge. Without discussion, they moved together, using their combined weight to hold the heavy canvas, while Mike secured it with rope and clips. Water ran down their faces, soaked their clothes, but neither spoke of stopping. A massive gust ripped through the barn, sending items crashing from shelves. Sarah lunged to catch a falling box, its contents spilling across the floor. Mike saw her freeze, staring at something that had tumbled out, a leather-bound Bible, its pages splaying open on the wet floor. "No, no, no," she breathed, dropping to her knees. Her hands trembled as she lifted the book, cradling it like a wounded bird. James's family Bible, all the history, the records. Mike knelt beside her, helping to gather the scattered pages. In the flickering lightning, he caught glimpses of handwritten notes in the margins, dates of births and deaths, photographs tucked between pages, a family's legacy, written in ink and memory. "Here," he said softly, shrugging out of his work. "Jacket. Wrap it in this. Keep it dry." Their hands met as she took the jacket, and for a moment, neither moved. Rain drummed on the roof. Wind rattled the walls. But in that space between heartbeats, the storm seemed very far away. "I should have moved it," Sarah whispered, "when I saw the roof was damaged. But there's been so much to handle, so many decisions." "We caught it in time," Mike assured her, helping her wrap the Bible carefully. "Sometimes that's all we can. Do be there when things start to fall." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, water dripping from her hair and something vulnerable in her eyes. "Is that what you're doing here, Mike? Catching things before they fall?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Before he could answer, another crack of thunder shook the barn. They both startled, the moment breaking like a soap bubble. The storm raged for hours. They worked in tandem, moving from one threat to another, adjusting tarps, diverting water, protecting what they could. Occasionally, their hands would brush, or they'd find themselves standing close in the darkness, and that same electric awareness would crackle between them. Finally, as suddenly as it had arrived, the storm began to pass. The wind died down to a whisper. The thunder retreated to distant grumbles. In the aftermath, they stood in the barn doorway, surveying the damage in the grey light. "It held," Mike said, satisfaction warming his voice. "Needs some adjustments, but nothing major." Sarah clutched the wrapped Bible to her chest, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being here, for knowing what to do." "That's what partners are for," Mike replied, then caught himself. "I mean, partners?" Sarah repeated, testing the word. A small smile touched her lips, despite her drenched clothes and exhaustion. "I liked the sound of that." They shared a look that seemed to hold all the words they couldn't say, all the questions they weren't ready to ask. Outside, the sun was breaking through the clouds, turning the rain-washed world to diamonds. The day after the storm dawned clear and crisp, the air scrubbed clean. Mike arrived early, eager to check for any damage they might have missed in the darkness. He found Sarah already in the barn, talking on her phone while sorting through papers that had been scattered by the wind. "The quarterly projections look strong," she was saying, her voice carrying that now familiar tone of authority. "But I want a full assessment of storm damage across all properties before we—" She stopped abruptly, seeing Mike. A business card slipped from her stack of papers, landing face up on the barn floor. Mike caught a glimpse before Sarah could Snatch it up. Sarah Mitchell, CEO, Mitchell Agricultural Enterprises. His hand stilled on his toolbox, mind working to process what he'd seen. But Sarah was already turning away, papers clutched to her chest, voice deliberately casual. "I need to take this inside," she said, hurrying toward the house. Mike watched her go, then turned to his work, trying to focus on the tangible problems he could solve. But questions kept surfacing like splinters. The way ranch hands deferred to her, those complex phone calls, the glimpses of financial documents far more sophisticated than a simple ranch would require. Around mid-morning, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the house. Through the barn's open door, Mike watched Sarah emerge to greet a man in an expensive suit. Their conversation carried across the yard in fragments. "The board is concerned about the timeline. My father built this company on careful decisions, not rushed ones." Sarah's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "But the shareholders will understand that I prioritize long-term stability over quick profits." Mike kept working, or pretending to work, his mind piecing together a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. The Sarah he'd come to know, the woman who shared dawn coffee and quiet conversations, who cradled her family Bible with trembling hands during the storm, seemed to exist in parallel with another Sarah, one who commanded empires with quiet confidence. The suited man eventually left, and Sarah didn't return to the barn. Through the house windows, Mike could see her moving from room to room, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. During his lunch break, he sat in his truck, turning recent memories over like puzzle pieces. The way she'd offered to advance him money for Katie's tuition without hesitation. Her deep knowledge of not just ranching but market futures and environmental impact reports. The casual mention of a board. A part of him wanted to confront her, to demand the truth. But a larger part remembered the vulnerability in her eyes when they'd saved the family Bible, the way she relaxed in her mother's restored rocking chair. He thought about his own careful separation of personal and professional life, the ways he protected Katie from his financial struggles. Maybe Sarah had her reasons for keeping parts of herself hidden. The question was, could he continue pretending not to see them? Late afternoon found him fixing a stubborn support beam, the rhythmic sound of his work echoing through the barn. He heard Sarah's footsteps before he saw her, recognized the hesitation in her approach. "Mike?" Her voice was quiet, almost tentative. "About this morning." "The beam's almost stable," he interrupted gently, giving her an out. "Another day or two, and this section will be stronger than before." He turned just enough to see relief wash across her face, followed by something that might have been gratitude or regret. "Stronger than before," she repeated softly. "That's what matters, isn't it?" The question seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meanings. Mike thought about foundations, how the strongest ones were built on truth, but also about how sometimes truth needed time to surface, like wood grain emerging under careful sanding. "It is," he agreed, turning back to his work. "That's what matters." But as the afternoon light slanted through the barn's gaps, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow, Mike wondered how long they could balance on this beam between truth and pretense, and what would happen when one of them finally had to step off. The invitation came as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barnyard. Sarah stood in the barn doorway, a familiar copper box held carefully in her hands, her voice carrying a note of carefully controlled nervousness. "I thought, maybe you'd like to stay for dinner, as a thank you for everything with the storm." Her fingers traced the embossed flowers on the recipe box's lid. "I found my mother's old recipes. Thought I might try her pot roast." Mike looked up from his work, caught off guard by the domesticity of the request. In the golden evening light, Sarah looked softer somehow, more like the woman who sat in the rocking chair than the CEO he'd glimpsed that morning. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Let me clean up first." In his truck, he kept a spare shirt and a bar of soap, lessons learned from years of job sites. He made himself presentable in the barn's utility sink, aware of Sarah moving through the house windows, her silhouette crossing back and forth as she prepared the meal. The kitchen, when he entered it, was warm with cooking smells and soft lamplight. Sarah had changed too, trading her work clothes for a simple blue dress that made her eyes look deeper, more luminous. The recipe box sat open on the counter, its cards worn with age and use. Mother believed good food was a form of love, Sarah said, lifting a yellowed card. She taught me all her recipes, but after she passed, she shrugged, a small, vulnerable gesture. The ranch consumed everything. I hardly cook anymore. Mike recognized the weight in her voice, the same tone Katie used when speaking about her mother's garden, now gone wild in Linda's backyard. Some inheritances were harder to maintain than others. My contribution, he said, setting a covered pie plate on the counter. Apple, my grandmother's recipe. Sarah's eyes lit up. You bake? Katie loves it. After the divorce, I learned. Some things are worth the effort. They moved around each other in the kitchen with surprising ease, setting the table, sharing small tasks. The recipe box remained open, its contents spilling stories with each card Sarah touched. This one, she said, pulling out a soup recipe, she made every Sunday. And this, her secret cornbread. The ranch hands still talk about it. Her voice caught. Sometimes I forget how much is lost, bit by bit, when you stop doing the things that connect you to your past. Mike understood. He thought about his father's workshop, gathering dust since his passing, about the tools he'd inherited but rarely used, each one holding memories of lessons learned and wisdom shared. The pot roast, when they sat down to it, was perfect, tender and rich with memory. They ate slowly, sharing comfortable silence broken by gentle conversation. Sarah spoke about her mother's garden, the flowers she'd grown alongside the vegetables. Mike told her about teaching Katie to bake, about the disasters and triumphs that came with learning. It felt natural, domestic in a way that made his heart ache. But underneath ran a current of tension, the weight of unspoken truths pressing against the edges of their carefully maintained fiction. The moment nearly shattered when a phone call interrupted dessert. Sarah's phone lit up with a name, Board Chairman Davis, visible for a moment before she hurriedly declined the call. Their eyes met across the table, acknowledgement flickering between them before they both looked away. The pie is wonderful, Sarah said softly, deliberately changing the subject. Katie is lucky, having these moments with you. We all need anchors, Mike replied, careful with his words. Things that remind us who we are, where we come from, no matter what else changes. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her mother's recipe box. Yes, she whispered, no matter what changes. The evening ended too soon, the autumn night drawing them to reluctant goodbyes. At the door, Sarah pressed a card into Mike's hand, her mother's apple pie recipe, the corners soft with age. For Katie, she said, another recipe to share. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and for a moment everything else fell away. Titles, secrets, complications. They were just two people, standing in a pool of porch light, holding something fragile and precious between them. Driving home, Mike could still taste apple pie and memory on his tongue, could still feel the ghost of Sarah's fingers against his. The recipe card sat on his passenger seat like a promise, or perhaps a question, waiting to be answered. The newspaper sat innocently on Sarah's desk, folded to the business section. Mike caught sight of it while bringing in supplies. Mitchell Ranch Empire expands. CEO Sarah Mitchell leads agricultural innovation. The headline seemed to mock their careful dance of pretense. Her photograph in the paper, a stark contrast to the woman who shared quiet sunrises with him. He deliberately turned away, focusing on the day's work. But the morning felt different, heavier. Sarah was distracted, constantly on her phone, her voice carrying that CEO edge he'd come to recognize. Through the barn's open door, he watched a stream of expensive cars arrive and depart, each bringing suited figures clutching portfolios and tablets. The merger timeline is aggressive, he overheard one saying. If we don't move now, I'm well aware of the timeline. Sarah's voice cut through, sharp as prairie wind. But this is still my company, and we'll do this my way. Mike threw himself into his work, letting the rhythm of hammer and saw drown out the corporate conversations, but his mind kept circling back to the newspaper, to the woman described in those black and white columns, agricultural visionary, business mogul, leader of a multi-million-dollar empire. So different from the Sarah who cradled her mother's recipe box, who sat in a restored rocking chair watching sunsets. Around noon, his phone buzzed. Linda's name flashed on the screen, and Mike's stomach tightened. The university called, she said without preamble. Katie's tuition payment is past due. They're talking about administrative withdrawal. Mike leaned against the barn wall, closing his eyes. How much time do we have? 3 days. Mike, she's doing so well. Her professors say, I know. He cut her off, gentle but firm. I'll figure it out. He ended the call, aware of Sarah watching him from the house porch. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away, disappearing. Inside to another meeting, another decision, another piece of her empire to manage. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. The parade of visitors eventually ended, leaving behind only the familiar sounds of prairie wind and distant cattle. Mike worked later than usual, trying to make up for time lost to his worried thoughts. The sun was setting when Sarah finally emerged from the house, looking worn. She crossed to where he was packing up his tools, her steps hesitant. Mike, about today. Beautiful sunset, he interrupted, nodding toward the horizon. They'd developed this pattern. Deflection, redirection, careful maintenance of their comfortable fiction. But tonight, Sarah didn't play along. I saw you found the newspaper. The words hung in the autumn air, heavy as storm clouds. Mike, carefully, placed another tool in his box, buying time. Wasn't looking for it, I know. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell her subtle perfume. Something expensive, he realized now. It's not that I wanted to deceive you. It's just, with you, I can be someone else. Someone simpler. Mike straightened, finally meeting her eyes. And which one is real, the CEO or the woman who shares my coffee? Both, she whispered. Neither. I don't know anymore. She gestured toward the house, the ranch, the empire beyond. All of this, it's what I am, but not who I am. Does that make sense? It did, more than he wanted to admit. He thought about his own compartmentalized life. Master carpenter to his clients, struggling father behind closed doors, something undefined but precious here with Sarah. We all wear masks, he said finally. Some are just more expensive than others. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, but her eyes remained troubled. The barn is almost finished. The observation caught him off guard, though he'd known this day was coming. The repair job that had brought them together was nearing its end. Soon, he'd have no reason to share these sunrises, these quiet moments between her worlds. Just a few more days, he agreed, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah opened her mouth as if to say more, then stopped as her phone buzzed yet again. The sound seemed to break something fragile between them. She glanced at the screen, her shoulders squaring, as her CEO mask slipped back into place. I should take this, she said, already turning away. Good night, Mike. He watched her walk back to the house, her silhouette rigid with responsibility. Through the window, he could see the newspaper still on her desk, its headline a reminder. Of all the ways their worlds didn't quite fit together, the drive home felt longer than usual, the prairie darkness deeper. Mike's thoughts bounced between Katie's tuition deadline and Sarah's 2 lives, between what was real and what was pretense. He wondered if, sometimes, the strongest foundations were built not on absolute truth, but on the truths we choose to share, and the masks we choose to lower. Evening painted the barn in shades of amber and gold, the setting sun streaming through the newly repaired roof in dusty shafts of light. Mike was cleaning up for the day when Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding a weathered envelope in her trembling hands. "I found this," she said softly, while looking for some old property documents. She ran her fingers over the faded paper. "It's the last letter James wrote to me before." She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Mike set down his tools, recognizing the weight of the moment. Sarah crossed to the workbench where they often shared their evening conversations, settling onto the rough wooden seat with practiced ease. "Would you—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Would you mind if I read you part of it?" "I'd be honored," Mike said quietly, keeping his distance, giving her space with her memories. Sarah's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope, carefully unfolding paper that had been creased and smoothed countless times. The golden light caught the tears in her eyes, making them shine. "My dearest Sarah," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Today I watched you in your father's office, handling the ranch accounts like you were born to it. You have. His head for business, but your mother's heart. That's a rare combination in our world." She paused, gathering herself. "The doctors say I don't have much time, but I'm not afraid. You're stronger than anyone knows, strong enough to carry this legacy, to make it your own. Just don't forget to let people see past the business suit sometimes. The real Sarah, the one who still dances in summer rain and reads poetry to the horses, she's the one I fell in love with." The letter shook in her hands. Without thinking, Mike moved closer, steadying her grip with his own. The touch was gentle, grounding, and Sarah leaned into it almost imperceptibly. "He knew me," she whispered. "The real me. Not the CEO, not the ranch owner, just me." "I see you too," Mike said softly, surprising himself with the admission. "Both sides, all of them." Sarah looked up at him then, really looked at him there. Faces close in the fading light. Time seemed to slow, to crystallize around them, like amber preserving a perfect moment. Mike could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, the slight tremble of her lips, the way her breath caught when he slowly, carefully reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. The distance between them shrank, measured now in heartbeats rather than inches. Sarah's free hand came up to rest against his chest, neither pushing away nor pulling closer, just feeling his heart race beneath her palm. Their lips were a breath apart when a truck door slammed outside, followed by voices, ranch hands coming to check the evening feed. Sarah pulled back as if burned, the spell shattered. The letter crinkled in her grip as she stood quickly, putting distance between them. "I should go," she said, not meeting his eyes. "There's a board meeting early tomorrow, and I need to—" "Sarah." Mike's voice was gentle, but she was already moving toward the door, her CEO mask sliding back into place like armor. "Good night, Mike," she said firmly, though he could hear the tremor beneath her professional tone. "Thank you for listening." He watched her hurry across the barnyard, the letter clutched to her chest like a shield. The setting sun caught her hair, turning it to fire for a moment before she disappeared into the house, leaving Mike alone with the ghostly impression of her hand on his chest and the memory of a kiss that almost was. Later, driving home under a sky sprinkled with stars, Mike could still feel the electricity of that moment, the perfect potential of it. But he also felt the weight of all that stood between them. His pride, her position, the carefully constructed walls they'd both built around their hearts. He wondered if some chances, like some sunsets, were meant only to be witnessed, not captured. Yet the memory of her trembling lips so close to his haunted him, a reminder that some risks might be worth taking, some walls worth breaking down. Mike arrived early the next morning, hoping to catch Sarah before her board meeting, to clear the air about last night. But the house was quiet, her car already gone. Only a manila envelope on the workbench showed she'd been there, labeled simply, "Mike," in her elegant handwriting. Inside, he found what he assumed was his final payment for the barn work, along with a legal document that had slipped in with the check. His eyes caught on the letterhead, "Mitchell Agricultural Enterprises Holdings, Executive Board Resolution." Below it, in stark black type, Sarah Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer and Principal Owner, authorized representative for all holdings. In excess of 50,000 acres. The numbers blurred before his eyes. Property values, annual revenues, corporate assets. This wasn't just wealth. This was empire. His hands, calloused from honest work, felt rough against the smooth paper, like they didn't belong in the same world. The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah's car was back, and she was walking toward the barn, her face lighting up when she saw him, until she noticed what he was holding. Mike. His name fell from her lips like a stone. That wasn't... You weren't supposed to... Supposed to what? His voice came out harder than he intended. Know the truth? About who you really are? I am who I've always been. She took a step forward, then stopped, seeing how he tensed. The business, the holdings, they're just things I'm responsible for. They're not me, aren't they? He held up the document. 50,000 acres, multiple corporate entities. You're not just some ranch widow getting by, Sarah. You're running an agricultural empire worth millions. And that changes things. There was a challenge in her voice now, matched by the hurt in her eyes. Changes what's happened between us. You lied to me. I never lied. She moved closer, her composure cracking. I didn't tell you everything. Because for once, someone was seeing me. Just me. Not the CEO, not the Mitchell fortune. Just Sarah. Mike thought of all their shared moments. Dawn coffee, sunset conversations, that almost kiss in the golden light. Had any of it been real? Or was he just another project, a quaint distraction from her corporate responsibilities? I would have understood, he said quietly. If you'd trusted me enough to tell me, would you? Sarah's laugh held no humor. You can barely look at me now, knowing the truth. Tell me, Mike, would you have fixed my mother's rocking chair if you'd known I could buy 1,000 new ones? Would you have shared your grandmother's pie recipe with a corporate CEO? That's not fair, isn't it? She was close now. Close enough. That he could smell her subtle perfume, the same scent that had almost driven him crazy yesterday. You're not angry because I didn't tell you. You're angry because knowing makes you feel... Feel what? He challenged when she hesitated. Less, she whispered, the way everyone feels when they find out. Like suddenly there's a glass wall between us, and everything that was real becomes questionable. Mike looked down at his hands, thinking of Katie's tuition struggles. Of all the times he'd stretched dollars to breaking point. Maybe the wall was always there, we just didn't want to see it. No. Sarah's voice was fierce now. No, that's not true. What we have, what we've built here, it's real. Money doesn't change that, doesn't it? He gestured to the document. You could have paid for Katie's entire college education with what you probably spend on corporate lunches. All those nights I lay awake wondering how to make tuition and you... He stopped, seeing the color drain from Sarah's face. I wanted to help, she whispered. That day I offered, and now I understand why you did. Mike carefully placed the document back in its envelope. Because it meant nothing to you. Just pocket change. That's not... I need to go. He turned away, unable to bear the tears forming in her eyes. The barn's almost finished. I'll send someone else to complete the final details. Mike, please. Her voice broke on his name. Don't let this change everything. He paused at the barn door, looking out at the prairie stretched endless and empty under the morning sun. It already has. The drive home was a blur, his mind replaying every moment, every conversation, now colored by knowledge he couldn't unknow. He thought of Sarah's words about masks, about being seen for who she really was. Maybe they'd both been wearing masks, playing parts in a story that was never meant to have a happy ending. The unfinished repair plans lay on Mike's kitchen table, haunting him like a letter left unwritten. Each penciled note, each careful measurement reminded him of mornings shared over coffee, of conversations that flowed as natural as prairie wind. 3 days had passed since he'd walked away from Sarah's barn, but the hollow ache in his chest felt fresh as a new wound. His phone buzzed, Katie's weekly check-in. He almost let it go to voicemail, but she'd always been too perceptive. She'd know something was wrong. "Dad, are you okay? You sound different." Mike stared at the repair plans, at his precise drawings of barn beams and junction points. "Just tired, sweetheart. How's school?" "They're threatening to drop me from my classes." Her voice was small, trying to be brave. "Mom said you're working on it." But the weight of it all pressed down on him. His daughter's future, Sarah's revelation, the tangled mess of pride and hurt, and something that felt dangerously close to love. "I'll figure something out, I promise." After hanging up, he found himself picking up his tools out of habit, wanting to lose himself in the simple honesty of woodwork. But every action reminded him of the barn, of Sarah watching him work with those careful eyes that saw too much. Across town, unknown to him, Sarah stood in her empty barn, breathing in the scent of fresh-cut wood and missed chances. The corporate paperwork that had shattered their careful illusion sat untouched on her desk, while Mike's tools marks were everywhere, in the solid new beams, in the carefully sealed roof, in all the broken things he'd made whole again. Her phone rang incessantly. Board members, investors, people who saw her as columns of numbers and potential profits. She let them go to voicemail, standing instead in the space where they'd almost kissed, remembering the warmth of his hand steadying hers as she read James's letter. The ranch hands whispered about the change in her. Gone was the CEO's confident stride, replaced by something more fragile, more human. They watched her spend evenings in the rocking chair Mike had restored, staring out at nothing, turning something over and over in her hands, a simple carpenter's pencil left behind in his hasty departure. Days blurred together. Mike threw himself into other jobs, working longer hours, taking on more projects, but every repair felt hollow, mechanical. He caught himself reaching for coffee at dawn, even though he was working across town. The newspaper's business section drew his eye against his will. Mitchell Agricultural Enterprises was expanding again, the article said. Sarah's corporate photo stared out at him, her smile professional and empty. Linda called again about Katie's tuition, her voice tight with worry. Mike sat in his truck afterward, staring at the statement of charges, the numbers swimming before his eyes. Pride was expensive, he realized. Maybe too expensive. In the evenings, he found himself driving past the ranch, telling himself he was just checking on his work. The barn stood solid against the prairie sky, its restored frame a testament to care and craft. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of Sarah on the porch, wrapped in an old cardigan that made her look more like his Sarah than the CEO in the newspaper. Once their eyes met across the distance, and the jolt of connection was almost physical. But he drove on, and she stayed on her porch, and the gap between their worlds yawned wide as the prairie itself. The unfinished repair plans watched him from the kitchen table each morning, a reminder of all the things left undone, unsaid. He'd drawn them with such care, mapping out not just repairs, but improvements, little touches he'd planned to add, small ways to make the barn not just functional but beautiful, like the carved detail he'd sketched for the new support beam, a pattern of wheat stalks that would catch the evening light. Now they were just papers, dried ink and fading graphite. Like the story of a divorced carpenter and a rancher's widow, they remained incomplete, a testament to what could have been, if the world were a simpler place. A week after walking away from the barn, Mike found the pressed wildflower, a prairie violet, delicate and perfect between the pages of the book Sarah had lent him about historic barn restoration. He'd forgotten he had the book, discovered it, while searching for something else entirely. The flower must have fallen from Sarah's mother's recipe card, the one with the apple pie instructions she'd given him for Katie. He held the dried bloom carefully, remembering how Sarah had pointed out the violets growing near the barn foundation. Mother always said they were stubborn things, she'd told him, growing right through concrete if they had to, just to reach the sun. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on what Sarah had hidden from him that he'd forgotten all she'd shared, stories of her mother, her grief for James, her quiet joy in summer sunsets. Money couldn't fake that kind of truth. His phone buzzed. The university bursar's office. The deadline for Katie's tuition had passed. She was being administratively withdrawn from her classes. Mike sat heavily in his kitchen chair, the pressed flower still in his hand. Pride was one thing, but letting it destroy his daughter's dreams. What kind of father's love was that? The drive to Mitchell Ranch felt both familiar and strange. Sarah's car was in the drive, but instead of going to the house, Mike headed for the barn. He needed to see it first, to remind himself of what was real. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. His penciled measurements still marked the beams. Sawdust still gathered in the corners he'd meant to sweep. The evening light slanted through the gaps he'd planned to seal, painting stripes across the floor. "I wondered if you'd come back." He turned. Sarah stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the setting sun. She'd been crying, he could tell, but her voice was steady. "The book you lent me," he said, holding up the pressed violet. "Found this inside." Sarah moved closer, her eyes fixed on the flower. Mother's favorite. She used to press them between her Bible pages. She looked up at him. "I've missed you." The simple honesty of it cracked something in his chest. "I've missed you too, I know." "You're angry?" "Not angry," he interrupted gently. "Not anymore, just lost, I guess, trying to figure out where I fit in your world. The same place you always did." She gestured around the barn. "Here, where you see what needs fixing and know how to make it right. Where you drink coffee at dawn and tell me stories about Katie." Her voice caught. "Where you're just Mike and I'm just Sarah, but you're not just Sarah," he said. "You're Sarah Mitchell, CEO, owner of half the county. And you're Michael Reeves, master carpenter, artist in wood, father who'd move heaven and earth for his daughter." She stepped closer. "We're all more than one thing, Mike. Why does my bank account have to change what's real between us?" He thought about Katie, about dreams deferred and pride's bitter cost. My daughter's being dropped from her classes. Tuition deadline. Sarah's intake of breath was sharp. "Let me help. Not as a CEO, not as a wealthy woman, but as someone who cares about you both. Someone who knows what it's like to have doors closed because of other people's assumptions about who you are." Mike looked down at the pressed violet in his palm. So fragile, yet somehow enduring, like truth, like love. "I don't know how to be comfortable with that kind of help." "Then let's figure it out together." Sarah's hand covered his, both of them now holding the flower. "The way we figured out dawn coffee and sunset conversations. The way we learned each other's stories, one day at a time." The warmth of her hand, the familiar scent of her perfume, the honest need in her voice. It all felt real in a way that corporate documents and bank accounts never could. Mike looked at their joined hands, at the violet that had survived between pages, waiting to be found. "One day at a time," he agreed softly. And for the first time in weeks, the prairie wind through the barn felt like possibility instead of goodbye. The first nail Mike had pulled from the barn sat on Sarah's desk, its weathered surface catching the morning light. She'd kept it all this time, a small token of the day they'd started this journey together. Now, watching Mike return to work, through her office window, she held it like a talisman, remembering how different everything had felt that first morning. "The paperwork's done," she said when he came in for their usual coffee. "Katie's reinstated in all her classes. The scholarship fund will cover this semester and the next." Mike's hands tightened on his mug. "Scholarship fund?" "The James Mitchell Memorial Scholarship for students showing exceptional promise in medical studies." She met his eyes steadily. "It's been part of the company's educational initiatives. For years, Katie's credentials more than qualify her." The tension in Mike's shoulders eased slightly. Not charity then. Something earned, something his daughter deserved on her own merit. "Thank you," he said softly. They settled into a new rhythm, different from before, but no less true. Mike worked on finishing the barn, refusing to leave it incomplete, despite Sarah's protests that she could hire someone else. But now their conversations were more open, the weight of secrets lifted. "Tell me about your board meeting," he'd say during lunch breaks, genuinely interested in her challenges. And she'd share the real struggles of balancing corporate responsibility with ranch traditions, knowing he'd understand both worlds in his own way. "The farming community trusts you," he observed one evening, watching her review agricultural impact reports, "because you know the life, not just the business." Sarah looked up, surprised and touched by his insight. "Like they trust you," she replied, "because you don't just fix things, you understand their worth." The nail sat between them. On the desk, a simple piece of metal that had held something together once and might do so again. Mike picked it up, turning it in his calloused fingers. "First one I pulled," he said. "Thought about giving up that day, seeing how much work the barn needed. What made you stay?" He met her eyes. "The way you looked at it, like it was more than just a building, like it mattered." "It did matter," she said softly. "It still does." They both knew they weren't just talking about the barn anymore. Their relationship had changed, transformed by truth into something more complex, but also more honest. Like the nail that had been repurposed, given new meaning beyond its original function. The next morning, Mike arrived to find Sarah on the phone with her corporate office, handling a crisis with calm authority. But instead of hiding in the barn, he brought her coffee, watched her work with open admiration for her capabilities. When she hung up, she smiled at him, a real smile, not her CEO mask. "The ranch hands tell me you've been asking about our sustainable farming initiatives," she said. Mike nodded. "Figured I should understand all parts of your world. Besides," he grinned, "some of those environmental designs need a carpenter's touch. Your solar barn proposal could use some practical modifications." Sarah's eyes lit up. "You looked at the proposals?" "Left them on your desk, along with some sketches." He paused. "If you're interested in a working man's perspective," the way she looked at him then, like he was offering something precious, made his heart skip. "I'm always interested in your perspective, Mike, on everything." Later that day, they stood together in the barn doorway, watching the sun paint the prairie gold. The nail lay forgotten on Sarah's desk inside, but its lesson remained. Sometimes the strongest bonds are forged from the simplest beginnings, tested by strain and made stronger for the testing. "Stay for dinner?" Sarah asked, not turning to look at him, her voice carrying a note of carefully controlled hope. "Only if you let me teach you my grandmother's casserole recipe," Mike replied, just as carefully. "Since you shared your mother's pie." Her hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally. "One recipe at a time." He squeezed her hand gently. "One day at a time." The hand-drawn plans spread across Sarah's kitchen table caught the morning light. Mike's precise sketches showing the barn not just as it was, but as it could be. Solar panels integrated seamlessly into the restored roofline, a modern workshop space that honored the original architecture, innovative storage solutions that would make James proud. "It's not just a restoration anymore," Mike explained, his finger tracing the elegant lines. "It's an evolution, keeping the heart of what makes it special while letting it grow into something new." Sarah stood close beside him, her coffee cooling, forgotten as she studied the drawings. "Like us?" she asked softly. He smiled, catching her meaning. "Maybe. These newer sections here," he pointed to the workshop area, "they're designed to support the old structure while adding something fresh. Different materials, different purposes, but working together." "Tell me more about this space," Sarah said, indicating the workshop. Her hand brushed his as she leaned closer and neither pulled away. "I thought, well, the ranch needs a proper wood shop for repairs, improvements." He hesitated. "And maybe for teaching." "Teaching?" Katie mentioned that the local high school lost its shop program. Those skills, that craft knowledge, it shouldn't disappear. "I thought maybe, if you were interested, we could offer apprenticeships. Combine traditional carpentry with your sustainable agriculture initiatives." Sarah's eyes lit with understanding. "Creating opportunities for local youth, preserving practical knowledge while advancing our environmental goals. She shook her head in wonder. You see how things connect, don't you? How to build bridges between different worlds. Learn from the best, Mike said, bumping her shoulder gently. A certain CEO who knows the value of both boardroom strategy and dawn coffee with ranch hands. They shared a smile, remembering how far they'd come from those early days of careful pretense. The plans between them represented more than just barn improvements. They were a blueprint for possibility, for finding ways to merge their separate worlds into something stronger. The board will want cost projections, environmental impact studies, Sarah mused, her business mind engaging with the idea. Already started them, Mike replied, pulling out another sheet. Had some help from Katie. Turns out pre-med students are pretty good with research and numbers. Sarah's eyebrows rose. You told her about the project? About everything, he admitted. She said, and I quote, Dad, if you let pride stop you from building something amazing with someone amazing, I'm never baking you another pie. Sarah's laugh filled the kitchen, bright and real. Smart girl. Too smart, Mike agreed. She also said to tell you she wants to interview you for her Women in Leadership seminar paper. I'd be honored. Sarah's voice softened. She's lucky to have a father who shows her that real strength comes from being willing to learn, to adapt. Mike looked at her then, really looked at her. Sarah Mitchell, CEO of an agricultural empire, who could discuss corporate strategy and cattle breeding with equal authority, who kept her mother's recipes and his first barn nail, who had shown him that wealth didn't have to change what was real between two people. I was so afraid, he admitted quietly, of not belonging in your world, of being seen as less somehow. Oh, Mike. Sarah's hand found his cheek, turning him to face her. You've never been less. Your work, your integrity, your heart, they're worth more than any account balance. I knew that from the first morning, watching you study this old barn, like it was precious. It was precious, he said, is precious, like all the things we build with care and truth. Sarah's eyes went to the plans, to their shared vision sketched. In clean lines and careful measurements. Partners, she asked, an echo of that storm-swept night when they'd first used the word. Mike's hand covered hers where it still rested on his cheek. Partners, he agreed. In whatever we build next. The new nameplate caught the autumn sunlight, its carved letters deep and sure. Mitchell Reeves Barn. Mike ran his fingers over the wood one last time, checking for any rough spots before mounting it above the great doors. Behind him, Sarah watched from the paddock fence, her eyes bright with unshed tears. It's perfect, she said softly. James would have loved it. The barn stood renewed in the morning light, its restored frame solid and true. But it wasn't just a restoration anymore. Subtle changes marked its evolution. Solar panels gleamed discreetly along the south-facing roof, while inside, the new workshop space waited for its first apprentices. Traditional and modern, past and future, merged seamlessly in wood and steel and promise. Mike descended the ladder slowly, taking in the full view. 6 months of work had transformed more than just the building. Every beam, every joint, every careful improvement told the story of two people learning to build something together, something that honored the past while embracing the future. The first class starts next week, Sarah said, as he joined her at the fence. 12 students, all local. The school board's talking about giving shop credits for the apprenticeship program. Mike smiled, remembering the community meeting where they'd presented their vision. Sarah had worn her CEO confidence like a well-tailored suit, but spoke with a ranchwoman's practical wisdom about the need to preserve traditional skills. He'd shown his drawings, explained the technical details, and watched understanding bloom. In the eyes of parents who wanted more options for their children than college or nothing. Katie's coming home this weekend, he said. Wants to see the finished project, and you. Sarah's hand found his on the fence rail. Both of my favorite pre-med students in one place. I'll make mother's apple pie. The ease of it still amazed him sometimes. how naturally their lives had woven together, how right it felt to face each day as partners in all things. Sarah still ran her empire with quiet authority, but now she did it from a restored ranch office where his woodwork complemented her modern technology. He still worked with his hands, but now his craftsmanship shaped both practical repairs and innovative designs for sustainable agriculture. A truck pulled up, the first delivery of workshop equipment. Sarah squeezed his hand before stepping forward to handle the paperwork, every inch the capable CEO. But she winked at him over her shoulder, a private gesture that bridged their professional and personal worlds. Mike watched her, remembering that first morning when he'd seen her as just another client. Now he saw all of her, the businesswoman and the ranch hand, the grieving widow and the strong survivor, the woman who could command boardrooms but still danced in summer rain. "Where do you want these, Mr. Reeves?" The delivery man gestured. "To the crated tools." "I'll show you," Mike said, leading the way into the barn. Inside, sunlight streamed through the restored windows, catching the new brass fittings Sarah had insisted on. They gleamed like the future, bright and full of possibility. Later, as the sun set behind the prairie horizon, they sat together on the paddock fence, shoulders touching. The barn's new weather vane, a delicate sculpture of prairie grass in steel, another merger of their aesthetics, turned gently in the evening breeze. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, her voice thoughtful, "about names and partnerships and building things that last." Mike turned to look at her, catching something deeper in her tone. She met his eyes steadily, the way she had that first morning, over coffee, the way she had during the storm, the way she always did when speaking truth. "The barn looks good with both our names," she continued, "but I was wondering how you'd feel about making that partnership more official." Mike's heart stumbled, then steadied. Like a barn raising, like a business merger, like love itself. Sometimes the biggest moments came dressed in simple words. "I'd feel," he said carefully, joy building in his chest, "that it's about time." Sarah's smile dawned slow and bright as sunrise. Behind them, their barn stood solid in the gathering dusk, its new nameplate a promise already fulfilled. 2 names, 2 worlds, one shared future built on foundations strong enough to hold whatever came next. 1 year later, Katie stood before the newly installed bulletin board in the Mitchell Reeves barn, pinning up a family photo taken on her father's wedding day. In it, Mike and Sarah stood before the barn doors, both radiant with joy. But it was the details that told the real story. Sarah's simple dress and work boots, Mike's clean suit and calloused hands, the way they looked at each other like they were sharing a wonderful secret. The workshop hummed with activity behind her. The second class of apprentices was learning dovetail joints, their careful concentration a testament to Mike's patient teaching. Through the open doors, she could see Sarah in the distance, moving easily between ranch hands and corporate visitors, equally comfortable in both worlds. Katie smiled, remembering her father's phone call a year ago, his voice thick with emotion as he tried to explain how everything had changed. "She sees me, Katie," he'd said. "All of me, and I see all of her. The rest we'll figure out together." They had figured it out. The Mitchell Reeves Agricultural Innovation Program was becoming a model for sustainable farming practices across the state. Local kids learned traditional crafts alongside modern techniques, while Sarah's business acumen and Mike's practical knowledge created opportunities neither could have managed alone. The sound of familiar laughter drew Katie outside. Sarah and Mike were returning from their morning rounds, their easy intimacy visible in the way they moved together. Sarah's corporate polish had softened around the edges, while Mike carried himself with quiet confidence that had nothing to do with his new position as Director of Agricultural Innovation. "Finished with your hospital rotation paperwork?" Sarah called out, spotting Katie. "All done. Dr. Mitchell Reeves is officially ready for her residency," Katie answered, still getting used to her new hyphenated name. She'd taken it legally after The wedding, proud to be part of this unlikely family they'd built. Mike wrapped an arm around his daughter, pride shining in his eyes. "Your mother's coming for dinner," he said. "She and Sarah have been plotting something about a medical scholarship program for rural students." "We're just expanding what works," Sarah added, her CEO pragmatism warming with personal passion. "Good ideas deserve to grow." They stood together, looking at the barn that had started it all. The autumn light caught the solar panels and the vintage weather vane, making both glow. Inside, young voices mixed with the sound of tools and learning. On Sarah's desk, a certain worn nail still held a place of honor, while Mike's original drawings hung framed in their shared office. "I have a board meeting in an hour," Sarah said, checking her watch. "Walk me to the house." Mike smiled, the same smile he'd worn when she'd first offered him coffee on a misty morning. Always. Katie watched them go, hand in hand across the barnyard. Her father's work boots left marks in the dirt alongside Sarah's elegant shoes, too. Paths now permanently intertwined. The family photo on the bulletin board caught the light, drawing her eye again. But it wasn't the only photo there. Surrounding it were pictures of apprentices with their first completed projects, newspaper clippings about the innovation program, a faded image of James Mitchell standing proud before the barn he'd built. Past and present, craft and commerce, love and legacy, all finding their place in this space her father and Sarah had created. A young apprentice called out for help with his joint work. Katie turned from the bulletin board, ready to share what her father had taught her about wood and patience and building things to last. Behind her, the Mitchell-Reeves barn stood strong against the prairie sky, its doors open wide to whatever future might come.